If you've come to the CDR panel, you are in the right place. Thanks for hanging in until the end of the second day in COP. Glad to have you all here. My name is Barry Besser, and I'm with the Climate Center. The Climate Center is a clean energy and climate policy nonprofit working in Sacramento, the capital of California, on speed and scale solutions to the climate crisis. And we believe that what happens in California can influence what happens in the rest of the United States, and we hope the world as well. So we are partnering today with the World Ocean Council and also ICOS-ERIC to discuss the important role of carbon dioxide removal to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and how to ensure that CDR, carbon dioxide removal, is done responsibly, which means not replacing the need for rapidly reducing emissions. Those two things we need to do simultaneously, which I'll talk more about in a second. And also ensuring that communities on the front lines of these technologies are protected. So this slide is going to show you a little bit of why is CDR important. Why should we even be talking about this? There's so much we need to do on climate change. And for a lot of people, this seems like something that needs to happen a decade from now. So the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us in 2018 that we need to do two things to avert climate catastrophe. The first is to radically reduce our emissions by about half, 45% by 2030. The second is to remove 1,000 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's 1 trillion tons of carbon. That is a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. And let's remember that we are emitting at approximately the rate of 40 gigatons a year. So we're adding to that legacy that we have in our atmosphere. Now, I think it's obvious to all parties here at the COP that we're not doing that well on the first part of that equation in terms of reduction. You'll see a few things on that slide. Our current policies right now are going to deliver a 3.1 Celsius increase in temperature, and countries are on track for a 9% increase in emissions given their current commitments. And that's if they deliver on their current commitments. That said, why is it important for us to focus on carbon dioxide removal? Because as you've just heard, we have an enormous job to do, and these industries are just nascent. They're just getting off the ground, and they will take years to develop and to scale up. So we probably should have started in earnest 5 years ago, but the next best time is now. So carbon dioxide removal approaches span a huge range of activities, and this slide gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things out there. Today, we're going to break them into generally two things, which are marine-based approaches and terrestrial approaches, and we'll have speakers on both of those topics. Now, one of the things I want to say is that carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal are not the same thing. These two things are often conflated, and it's very problematic that that happens. So they both do deal with capturing carbon, right? Hence the confusion. But that's where it ends. As I've said, carbon dioxide removal is about getting legacy emissions. Those are emissions that are already in the atmosphere that we're going to now draw down and retain in some way. And there are various ways that that's done. I'll let our speakers address that. Carbon capture and storage is preventing future emissions, usually at the smokestack level. Why this distinction is important to maintain is because if we conflate those two, it is possible that industry will use that to continue business as usual and continue to pollute the atmosphere. So the Climate Center is working with partners in California on what would be responsible CDR policies for our state. And I just want to share some of these principles with you that we've come up with. And hopefully my colleagues today will add to this list. But these are some things that we think are really important. And I've mentioned a few of them already. First, removing past pollution is absolutely essential to stabilizing the climate. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Second, we must accelerate cutting GHG emissions and phasing out fossil fuels. CDR should not be and should be accounted for totally separately than carbon reduction. It should not be an excuse for going slower. CDR projects should be community-centered and designed with input from the local communities in which these facilities are going to be put into. And CDR projects must not exacerbate existing pollution or other environmental problems that are happening in these communities. And finally, as I said, there are a whole host of different approaches to CDR. Sometimes they're called technological approaches on the one hand, and sometimes they're called nature-based solutions on the other. What I want to say is we need them all. And the nature-based solutions are really critical because they have many co-benefits, including helping us adapt to the increasing pressures we're going to experience from climate change going forward. Before we get into our presentations today, I do want to say just a quick thing about the US election. So there was a bit of a cataclysmic shift for some of us who care about climate in the US last week. And I think what it means is that the role for both local and subnational governments and global leadership is more important now than ever. And I'm going to predict that California doesn't back off in any way its commitments to climate, but rather they intensify. And there's a whole host of reasons for that too, some of which are principled and some of which are politics. I'm not going to go into the politics, but you could probably think it through. And as evidence of where California is at this moment, the same week that the presidency of the United States changed, California passed a historic climate bond for $10 billion. And this bond did all kinds of things, from helping mitigate wildfire, helping people to adjust to drought, extreme heat, making investment in wind energy possible, and also funding some of the kinds of projects we want to see for nature-based solutions for CDR. And the state also has set really ambitious goals in the last year to do land management and historic conservation on 50 million acres of California land. That's about half the total land in California. So this is an enormous goal that has been set. Now, we still have to follow through on that goal, and that's very important. But you can see that California is setting goals that take us towards a more livable future. And then finally, I just want to say, for several reasons, the state has gotten early investment from CDR, from the federal government, and private industry. So I think it's likely to be relevant in the US because it's relevant in the California market. And why am I going on and on about California, besides the fact that I'm from there? Because California is the 5th largest economy in the world. And what happens in California is hugely significant for the United States. And if California is going to take a climate positive position in the next few years, it is going to slow down any backsliding on the part of the federal government. Not stop, but at least slow down. Okay, let's go through our agenda quickly together. So we talked a little bit generally about the role of responsible carbon dioxide removal. We're going to then go into the importance of community engagement in this process. This is not something that's happened in industries in the past, so we want to make sure it is something that happens going forward. And then we're going to talk about responsible research, development, and commercialization in marine carbon dioxide removal. And here, something very important is, how do we know that we're actually reducing the amount of carbon that we say we are, whatever the technology is? So the role of measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification is hugely important. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a discussion of policy measures and also some challenges to ensuring speed and scale happens responsibly. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Louise Bedsworth, who is the Executive Director at the Center of Law, Energy, and the Environment at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also serves as a Senior Advisor to the California-China Climate Institute. Before joining CLE, which is what we affectionately call that long that long institution, she spent nearly a decade working for the state of California, including serving as the executive director of the Strategic Growth Council. She's also held positions at the Public Policy Institute for California, Union of Concerned Scientists, Redefining Progress, and International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. Louise received a BS in Earth, Atmosphere, and Planetary Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and an MS in Environmental Engineering and a PhD in Energy and Resources from both from the University of California, Berkeley. Please welcome Louise.
Well, thank you, everybody. Nice to see you. So I'm going to just talk about a project that we're doing where we're actually really trying to innovate on the way, basically, how do we build a responsible approach to deployment? And this is being done in the context of one of the federal grants that has come into California through the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we are conducting a feasibility study to design a regional direct air capture hub, but doing it in a community-centered and community-led way. And so we really took on this challenge because just to sort of emphasize some of what Barry already talked about is we are facing an enormous challenge right now, which is we have to transition our economy and the environment and do so in a way that does not duplicate the patterns that we've seen in previous energy transitions that have generally concentrated pollution in specific communities, left communities behind, and increased inequities. So that is, we have an opportunity right now to really design these projects and this transition differently. At the same time, we need to be supporting emergent technologies that are needed to meet the challenge and do so in this, while also addressing issues of community-centered processes and equity. And we need to be moving at a pretty good clip to get this all done. And I'm sure there are many other challenges, but those are just three that are driving a lot of what we're thinking about. So we already heard this discussion around just sort of the spectrum of carbon removal technologies. And we are focused in our project on direct air capture with storage. So we are working with three different direct air capture companies, 2 CO2 to products companies, and a couple other energy providers to do this work. We are focused on carbon removal, so removing legacy emissions from the atmosphere. And we are looking both at geologic sequestration of the carbon that is removed, but also looking at the pathways to take that CO2 and convert it to products. So this is just a schematic of what we're trying to think about with this project. So this, as I said, is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. It is a feasibility study to look at the feasibility of a hub. So a hub is where we put multiple technologies onto a campus We integrate that with clean energy provider, potentially other technologies, like I said, CO2 to products, but we're also considering water and other carbon removal technologies. There would be a hub owner or some type of an owner or business model, which I'll touch more on, and a governance structure that delivers real and measurable community benefits while also removing carbon from the atmosphere. We are designing this study to be co-produced and co-created with a community, and have committed as a project team, which has about 17 members, that if we cannot meet both community and technical feasibility criteria, that we would deem this project infeasible. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what this looks like. But we have a set of technical criteria from the Department of Energy that we need to be able to demonstrate, and we are working with the community to elicit and capture sort of a community set of vision and goals, which we will also be designing toward in this project. And I just want to talk a little bit about why this matters so much. And this is, I'm sure, not unique to this place, but I want to share a little bit about where we are approaching this study, which is the San Joaquin Valley in California. That is the Great Central Valley that runs down the center of the state. The southern portion is the San Joaquin Valley. It covers approximately 27,000 square miles. It is a geology that is very conducive to carbon capture and carbon sequestration. It is also a part of our state that has many sources of emissions. And because of its geology and its history as the oil and gas producing part of our state, it is also received, is where four regional direct air capture hub projects were awarded, 3 feasibility studies, 1 design study, as well as many other carbon removal studies that are in different programs through this recent influx of federal money. And so this is an area where they are feeling very inundated by a set of projects with an emergent technology, where they are looking, where we don't really have a regulatory framework for what this will look like. And so it is a community that also is a very active environmental justice community. And so they are definitely on heightened alert about what this could look like. I think the other important picture of the San Joaquin Valley is this picture, which is from the tool that the state uses to identify disadvantaged communities, which is a state definition in state law that looks at communities where we have high concentrations of poverty, other socioeconomic factors such as linguistic isolation, lower educational attainment, as well as poor health factors. It's a spatial model that then identifies our most, what we call disadvantaged communities. So the San Joaquin Valley is the bright orange part in that map. The green are the least disadvantaged. The red and orange are the most. And so what you can see is pretty close alignment with that area of high geologic storage potential. The San Joaquin Valley experiences some of the worst air quality in the nation, some of the highest levels of air pollution, due both to sources of emissions as well as the topography of the area. It is also a highly economically vulnerable area of our state. As I mentioned, it has a large oil and gas industry, which we will ideally be phasing out as we meet our greenhouse gas emission standards. It is also a major agricultural region of our state. And as we are looking to managing our water resources, we are going to be looking to fallow certain lands. And so you have 2 major industries that are facing a lot of economic stress with this transition and the stresses of climate change. It also has 2 major freeways that run down the east and the west sides of the valley, so major sources of emissions, major goods movement corridors, and as I said, has a very strong environmental justice advocacy community. And so just to take those 2 pictures and put them side by side, you can see these 2 things really overlap, where we have this high potential for carbon storage and these high levels of disadvantage and communities experiencing high levels of pollution. And so those 2 things, you have a lot of skepticism in the community, you have a lot of concern in the community, and a strong feeling that they don't want to once again be basically bearing the brunt of our energy transition like they have in the past. So as we've been doing this work, we're just getting started with this project. We've been conducting some early outreach in the San Joaquin Valley, primarily through a series of off-the-record roundtables, and several important themes have emerged. One is there's a very strong concern about the use of this technology to extend the operating lifetime of the fossil fuel industry in the region. And so how do we deploy this technology, but do so in a way that does not slow down the phase out of fossil fuel and the associated pollution? There is a priority for clean energy sources. So as we think about a direct air capture hub, it takes an incredible amount of energy to remove carbon. And so there is a demand that this be done in a way that is with zero emission energy sources, and that we are ultimately reducing pollution in the region. There are strong demands for transparency and accountability, both in this study that we are doing and in any subsequent activities that come. So we are doing a paper study, it's a feasibility study, but ultimately could lead to design and to building a hub if successful. And so how do we ensure that throughout? The other one I didn't put on here is because we have also been brought in CO2 to products companies, there's a strong desire to see as much useful product to come out of the captured CO2 as possible because of concerns that folks have with both pipeline transport, but also with the ultimate storage of the CO2 in the ground. And so we're really going back to those challenges at the beginning. We are really trying to conduct meaningful engagement with the communities. And it's not just engagement, it really is how do we put power in the hands of the community to be driving these decisions? And then how do we also, again, support the companies that have signed up to be part of this process and part of this project? So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just want to give a sense of that this is really intended to be, and we clearly don't have a graphic designer yet, so intended to be a highly interactive project where we have technical and feasibility work happening, as well as community feasibility work, all connected through a community oversight structure that we are building out. Our project team also includes community-based organizations, and then we have included in our budgeting compensation for additional partnership and engagement. Ultimately, the deliverables are going to be a hub concept and design, as well as an ownership model and an owner and a community benefits plan. So some of I'll talk a little bit about these pieces on the community engagement side that we think are really critical to this project being successful. The first is the establishment of a community oversight council. This is going to be representative of a number of different interests. I mentioned we've been working a lot with environmental justice organizations, but there are many interests in the region, and the community is not a monolith. So we really have to build an oversight structure and co-create it with the community to be representative of that diversity. Again, we have built-in compensation for expertise, time, and effort. We are also, as required by the U.S. Department of Energy, we will be developing a community benefits plan. And this will be co-created at all stages of the process and driven by and framed by community-created goals and vision. As part of that, we are also trying to look at innovative approaches to ownership and governance, including community ownership and cooperative ownership structures, as well as mechanisms for revenue and profit sharing with the community. Another key piece of this work is a two-way learning process where we are also building in carbon removal curriculum that we are designing to meet the needs of the communities that we are working with, but then also drawing the information from the community to really shape and guide the study. As we're moving forward, we have several key points where we are looking to co-create this process. And the first really begins with, where does this hub even sit? So most projects that were submitted have a site decided, and we have 3 potential site locations that we will be evaluating, basically building out a framework for site evaluation and evaluating with the community to decide which, if any, of those sites are acceptable. And if there are multiple, we can try to proceed to look at multiple sites. We're launching a community-based design process that will be looking at the hub design and development, but also looking at hub resource analysis. So again, looking at things like energy sources, water. We will also be doing environmental health and safety work that will include data collection and monitoring requirements. And then we will also be looking at how we're combining CO2 storage as well as CO2 utilization. I mentioned again the community benefits plan, where we are conducting research on community ownership structures. We are also looking at the feasibility of creating a public authority for carbon in California. And so this would actually be treating carbon that is removed as a public good rather than as a for-profit commodity, which is what the current market is setting up. And so looking at the feasibility for setting up a public authority structure. And again, the community benefits plan that ultimately should inform the development of a legally enforceable community benefits agreement. And again, co-learning in all stages of the project. So the key point here, and this is where I'll wrap up, is that we are really trying, we know there's a lot of innovation happening with carbon, with direct air capture technology. And we see a real need for us to be doing innovation in how we are thinking about deploying and implementing that technology, and doing so in partnership with the community. So what we're really hoping to do is, one, complete a feasibility study, but I think equally importantly is to develop a replicable and accessible model for doing a community-engaged and community-led approach. We want to extend this project beyond just the project, but also to ultimately the ownership structure and to governance and public oversight. And then really thinking about how we can take these projects and transform them to encompass environmental benefits, but also serve the greater public good, and how we can build a model for that. And feel like with the emergence of CDR technologies, we have a real opportunity to approach them in a way that looks different than we have in previous infrastructure investments. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I think you can see how important it is to engage communities in this. It's not easy work. So thank you, Louise, for the foundational work you guys are doing there. So next, I would like to introduce Jill Story, who's with the World Ocean Council Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal and is an advisor there. She is working there to facilitate the advancement of marine-CDR as a sector to accelerate the transition to net zero. She has 25 years of experience working in the international consulting field with large corporate clients and financial institutions, having been a partner with Anderson in the United Kingdom, KPMG in the UK and Hong Kong, and Deloitte in the UK and Australia. She is a qualified chartered accountant and a chartered taxation specialist with an MBA and a master's in environmental science. You don't run across that too often. So thank you so much, Jill, for being here.
Well, thank you, Barry. And thank you, everyone who's joined us today. I'd like to extend my welcome on behalf of the World Ocean Council. It's a real honor to be speaking about marine CDR. I think it's one of the most important topics that is going to be covered in this COP. And I know Barry's done an excellent introduction in terms of putting it into context, but I just want to reiterate some of the points as to why it's really key that we start looking at marine CDR, and we start looking at it now. We know that the IPCC has told us that we need to remove 10 gigatons, that's 10 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. 10 gigatons, as Barry's told us, is 25% of our current emissions. It's more than the combined emissions of the US and India. And in 2023, in terms of durable CDR that was sold, we managed 4.5 million tons. So I think that gives a good indication of the scale of the challenge. So I think in 26 years, we've got to ramp up 2,222 times. That will make it the fastest growing industry in history that we need. I think it's a growth of about 30% a year for 26 years. So I think we're under no illusion of where we are and where we need to be. So far, of that 4.5 million, terrestrial CDR has taken up 90% of that. So the ocean, the marine piece is a really tiny percentage at the moment. We know that the ocean covers 71% of the surface area of the planet. It's the largest CO2 sink. It contains 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. So it becomes the obvious place to look. So if we can enhance some of the natural processes by just a little piece, that gives a big impact. For those of you who are new to marine or ocean-based CDR, a great place to start is to look at the National Academy of Science, Engineering and Medicine's US report in 2022. It's an excellent report. It gives a great overview of the different categories of solution and roadmaps and where further research is required. Basically, the approaches fall into two categories: biological approaches and chemical approaches. The biological approaches focus on photosynthesis, so it might be micro or macroalgae, and the chemical processes looking at increasing the alkalinity of the ocean or electrochemical processes. We've also been told that over 10 years, the amount of funding in R&D that's required to make sure that we approach this in a responsible and safe way is $2 billion. It's quite unusual that in September 2023, 200 of the leading scientists in the world signed an open letter to say this is an area we need to be looking at and we need to be doing more science, we need to be doing it now. One of the players in the ecosystem is an organisation, it's a not-for-profit organisation called Ocean Visions, and they're doing a great job of demonstrating the pathways, helping to educate, and also producing information like this, which is one of the maps of field trials that are happening around the world. I think it's important to show this because for some people, a couple of years ago, nothing was actually happening in the ocean. And now we can see that actually we have got early stage research happening and demonstration sites appearing. At COP26, I was on a panel with Sean, and one of the last points that are raised there was that we needed to start actually doing experiments in the ocean and move out of the lab. So this is an important step. It's also important that to make sure that all of this research is being undertaken in a responsible way. And I'm pleased to say that in the past couple of years, we've seen a number of policies and frameworks that have been put out in this space. And these are covering a variety of issues. So some of it's covering community engagement and some of the issues that Louise has been talking about. It's covering about taking small steps, so starting in the lab and progressing and taking, increasing gradually rather than moving to large scale experiments straight away. They're also talking about looking at life cycle analysis. It's important that actually the net amount is the carbon removal and that we haven't taken up so much, we haven't emitted so much in the process of trying to remove that actually we're not net negative. And that also environmental assessments are undertaken at the same time. I've got here a few examples of methodologies that have been put forward by some of the early stage companies. And I just taken a couple, but there's lots of examples out there. And I think anybody who's interested, it's worth digging into a bit of the detail and starting to look at these. The first one on the left is by Rewind Earth. Rewind Earth are looking at putting woody biomass into the Black Sea. The reason why I mention this framework is because you can see it's version 1.0. And I think it's good to talk through how people are actually coming up with these methodologies. So they put together their methodology, and then they've had a couple of months period where they put it out to the public, to other scientists, to try and get feedback. They've done a roadshow, lots of online meetings to try and explain what they're doing, so they can get input from a lot of different areas to try and improve that first version to get to 2.0. The next methodology, this is from Aquatic, and this methodology was put together with eco-engineers and ISO. So they've had other parties involved in putting it together. And as you can see, it's probably, the writing's a bit small on the slide, but you can see it's a very comprehensive methodology. So what's happening is often the early stage innovators are putting the first version of the methodology out there, but then they're developing and more people are getting involved and the science is getting better and more developed as we go. We've also got some of the registries like Isometric. They've got around 50, it's an early stage company, but they've already got about 15 climate scientists on their team. They're very focused on making sure they've got rigorous science. We've also got examples of government action. The EU in June 23 funded a project that's still going on, the strategies of the evaluation and assessment of ocean-based CDR. And then we're seeing a lot happening in the US. Department of Energy, NOAA, Canada, we've got some large-scale experiments starting up. So there's a lot of government action. We need a bit of everything here. There's a lot to do. I think it's also worth, as well as what's required for the climate, it's worth looking at the economic opportunity. McKinsey in June 2022 said that the long duration CDR market is a $1.2 trillion opportunity. And we know that oceans are quite a significant portion of that $1.2 trillion. So I think that's important because it shows that there is an economic benefit as well as the climate benefit. And there's also various co-benefits for the ocean around increasing biodiversity and also reducing acidification. So this is why I think this is one of the most important topics of this COP. So what's needed? Well, we need more focus on permitting. Often permitting wasn't introduced for MCDR. So we need to be able to get permits quickly to people who are doing early stage experiments. We need the permits over time to be for longer periods. We need to make sure that everything's happening in a controlled manner and we're looking at the ecological impact. So we need to be doing experiments in the ocean, not just for a short period, but over the longer term to make sure we pick up the different impacts and make sure we're causing no harm. We need rigorous and transparent MRV, as I've mentioned. And this is really critical because if we're hoping to get corporate demand, we need to have the rigorous and scientifically proven MRV. Because you can imagine, if you're the CEO today of a large publicly listed company, the last thing that you want to do is to be being accused of greenwashing. So you want to make sure that you have confidence in the science. We need the IMO on board. We need to raise awareness, improve community engagement, and then we need to really focus on the demand mechanisms. Last week, the World Ocean Council hosted a conference in Barcelona, and we had a number of sessions where we had some of the early stage MCDR companies. And one of the panels, I asked 4 of the companies, I said, what is your number one priority today? I know everybody's got multiple priorities that we need to move forward in lots of different ways. And all of them said the same thing. They said demand. They need demand for their credits to show there's a market so they can get investment and they can grow, they can undertake the experiments, and we can actually move forwards. I just got a couple of images of a couple of the different companies. This is GigaBlue. They're working on microalgae in New Zealand. This is Brilliant Planet. They're working also on microalgae in Morocco. This is Project Vesta. This image is Long Island. They're looking at putting olivine on beaches to increase ocean alkalinity. And we know that of the 2,000 largest listed companies in the world, that 60% of them have got net zero targets. And it's becoming increasingly clear that there's not going to be enough supply of durable CDR. So we're starting to see companies get involved in the purchasing. I think we really have to take our hats off to Microsoft, who are really leading the way in this field. Microsoft have bought 70% of the durable CDR credits in the marketplace. And then the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is Frontier. Frontier is a coalition of organizations, mostly US tech companies led by Stripe, Meta, Alphabet, McKinsey. And that's an advanced market commitment. They've committed $1 billion to purchasing durable CDR. And what that gives is an example of how other companies can get involved. It's difficult for companies to get involved sometimes if they're going in on their own, but if they can work in coalitions, it's helpful. So I'd just like to say that for everybody who's here and involved with COP, I think people will all get asked the question, what were your takeaways from COP? And one thing I'd like you to mention when you're asked that question is the importance of marine-CDR and what a difference it can make for the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jill. Presentation. So we have a colleague, Dr. Werner Kusch, who's going to join us remotely. So hopefully you are there, Werner. I'm going to start your intro.
I'm here.
Dr. Kusch is Director General of ICOS since March 2014. He's a biologist, plant ecologist, and an ecosystem scientist by education, and has worked on ecosystem carbon cycling for 25 years in Europe and in Africa. As Director General, Dr. Kusch is the legal representative and overall coordinator of the research infrastructure and currently managing the final internal integration of ICOS. He is responsible for the external representation of ICOS-ERIC and currently leading the development of its future strategy. Please take it away, Dr. Kusch.
Thank you very much. We call it usually ICOS, so that's easier than ICOS. Thanks a lot for being there, at least virtually. Greetings from Finland, and I will give you a bit more the European and the scientific perspective. So the title of my presentation is CDR needs scientifically rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification. Unfortunately, I cannot see my slides, so I have to fly blindly through it. And can you move the slides, or shall I share my slides? What's better for you?
The slides for you. We're just totally ready for the next one. Right now it's on the opening slide.
Okay, then go to the next slide, please. And that's a bit...
Hold on. We backed up.
if this is not working, I can also share my slides.
There we go. We're on this slide that's titled Rationale.
Okay, and yeah, that's, as I said, a bit the European perspective. The carbon removal certification framework, which is a quite important law, has been approved by the European Parliament in the spring of this year. And it contains some important principles that I think we can also see as general principles. There need to be additionality. And just listening to the previous talk, I can explain additionality perhaps. The ocean is currently already a sink of 10 gigatons of CO2. So 25% of our emissions are taken up by the ocean, another 25% by land ecosystems. So that's some kind of a free discount that we get from nature. And any CDR that should be tradable, it needs to be on top of this. It needs to be increasing this already existing things. The duration of the carbon storage is important. We're not talking about the carbon storage for some 10 years. We want to have a long-term removal of carbon from the atmosphere. There's another principle that's quite important. It should not harm the environment or even co-benefit with other sustainability principles, ideally with the concept of ecosystem integrity, meaning that there is also a benefit, for example, for biodiversity and other ecosystem benefits. And we should avoid double counting. Again, when Microsoft buys certificates, this same approach or the same thing should not show up in the national inventories or in the NDCs. So that's also an important principle. So when we are looking at this, we see a lack of standardized way of the connecting a specific measure, a specific activity to a certifiable amount of CDR in a standardized and scientifically sound way. And also there is a lack of monitoring technologies or at least monitoring rules. Next slide, please. And this is now starting from a very simplified and whatever, perhaps quite simple example. So let's say a farmer wants to change the management of the fields, and then he is, in terms of this European law, he's the actor, or she, but they cannot even directly go to the market. There is somebody in between, which I have called the broker. The broker quantifies the effect itself, so how much carbon is stored, and ideally provides a certificate that is then going to the market. Next slide, please. Now you should see a catalog of removal practices in the center. And this means that you need something that is giving a scientifically sound way or number how this effect can be quantified. Next slide. And this is fed by experiments, by process observations and long-term observations. So that's where science comes in. And next slide, there's also a monitoring process needed. And of course, this monitoring process should also feed into the knowledge. Next slide. So you should now see the central catalog a bit more in detail or bigger. So ideally, the information we need is regional information on climate, soils, management practices to define what the so-called baseline is. And if a baseline is already leading to carbon storage, then this carbon storage is something what we say is, let's say, a free natural service, and it's not something that is tradable. Tradable is only the additionality of a measure, and The quantification of the additionality is, of course, should be done in a relevant, conservative, accurate, complete, consistent, transparent, and comparable manner. So we need a lot of standardization, but also a lot of scientific input here. There are IPCC guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories, and ideally the calculation method should be in line with them. But there should be, in particular, an estimation of the duration of the storage, but also a description of the uncertainties and the risks. The risks are a very simple example. You do afforestation, 20 years you have a stable carbon sink, and then you have a drought and a fire, and all the carbon is back in the atmosphere, and that's a risk of a whole practice. The monitoring should be with on-site measurements, with remote sensing and modeling. I think that's quite clear that we need the whole toolbox of observations and calculations to do this. So next slide, please. Now you see on the right-hand side the experiments, the observations in red, and in the next slide, the question is, what is the scientific input into carbon dioxide removal? And I give you only one example where we go a bit more in detail into the science. Just the next one, please. You should see now beautiful sunflowers with some observations on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you see something like 15 years of observations of the carbon flux between a crop field and the atmosphere. So you can see that there are always spikes into the negative, which in our scientific definition is uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. But you have also areas when it's positive, which means that the very same cropland is giving in this half hour of measurement CO2 back to the atmosphere. And you can see, if you look more in detail on this, that there are very different patterns, and these patterns are related to the management. So you can have a fallow after the harvest in summer, a fallow in autumn, then you have a longer period with positive CO2 emissions from the ecosystems into the atmosphere. You can see that sometimes there are in summer white fields inside the uptake field, which could be a drought, for example, and so on and so on. So you have the climate, but you also have the management, and that's an example of long-term observations where we can draw a lot of conclusions, because out of these years, I think 5 years were the same management, winter wheat, and depending on the weather, the uptake was different, but also depending on the fact whether only the grains were harvested, or whether the grains and the straw were harvested, or whether the straw remained on the site. The carbon balance in this year is different, and we can draw a lot of conclusions out of this information. And of course, we can use this also for monitoring. Next slide, please. That's an overview of ICOS, the Integrated Carbon Observation System. So we have stations like this in many countries, in 16 countries in Europe, not only in croplands, also in grasslands and wetlands and forests. So we can say a lot about the CO2 fluxes between the land and the atmosphere. We have, that's the red dots, we have atmospheric in situ stations where we measure the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, in the lower troposphere. And from this, we can calculate differences, or from the differences between different observations, we can calculate the fluxes in between. So we have a second approach, and we have ocean stations that are fixed stations or ship lines. And this is mainly to measure the PCO2, and then from that calculate the ocean uptake. And so this is a comprehensive infrastructure that is, next slide please, that is supporting the science, you can see our data life cycle or our data flow from the stations, which are the dots in the top, through our so-called thematic centers, which are doing the centralized data processing and quality checks. We have central laboratories, and finally, we are providing for free and completely open and fair our data at the ICOS Carbon Portal. So our users can come to the ICOS Carbon Portal and get all of these data, and they can be, of course, also used for scientific studies. What is the best approach for CDR, and what are the risks, for example, as well. Next slide, please. Here you see an example of our data set. The first two are atmospheric data of methane, of CO2 on the top, methane in the middle, and then flux data, as I've already shown down there. These data are highly quality checked, and you see there are timelines that are sometimes more than 20 years, and all of this is open. You can scan the QR code and go to our Carbon Portal and look for our data products. This is one very short example about how these data are used in modeling. That's from our French colleague, a model called AgriCarbon AO processing chain, and you see in the third layer, which is dark green, that you have there our data are ingested already, and this model is coming out with different maps on the gross primary production, on the net ecosystem exchange, and of course with this modeling system, you can also make scenarios about different measures that can be applied in CDR. Now, next slide, you should already see my conclusions. My conclusion is that without scientific input, carbon dioxide removal in general, and also its certification in detail, will not work. We need science-based definitions based on systematic long-term observation, but also on experience. And this is pivotal for defining this additionality and the baselines, defining the duration of the carbon storage, and also show that there is no harm to the environment and co-benefits to sustainability. So yes, monitoring requires standardized methods, and in the end, we should also discuss money. This needs money to do all these kinds of observations. And there are, of course, different funding models for sustainable scientific input. One is, like most of the measurements we are currently doing, that this is paid by public money, and then the knowledge is transferred. But we heard that this is a huge market, a billion-dollar market, or even trillion-dollar market. And I think inside this market, there should also be discussions how the scientific input is financed in a stable way. Thank you very much. I think the next slide is already a picture of a very Nordic site where we are doing measurements. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Juan. And please stay with us, because after Sean speaks, we'll have some Q&A, I hope.
Sure, I will.
So our last speaker is Sean Fitzgerald. Sean is Director of the Center for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge and Director of Research for Cambridge Zero. He is a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and in early 2023, Sean was appointed by the UNFCCC supervisory body to serve as a methodologies expert on their roster of experts. Sean works at the interface of academic research, business, and government policy and public engagement. He worked extensively in the commercialization of new intellectual property arising from the university research and supported the UK government in rewriting the policy documents for building standards. He has held a number of business strategy roles in the private sector, and from 1995 to 1997 was faculty member at Stanford University, leading the geothermal research program. Sean, please take it away.
Great. Well, good afternoon. So I'm going to adopt a slightly different style, if that's okay. Instead of having any visuals to distract you, I'm going to ask you to just listen what hopefully comes out of my mouth and makes sense. So I'm going to dwell, actually, if you think carefully about the topic and the title of this session, carbon dioxide removal, policy considerations for responsible deployment on land and in the ocean. So I want to actually dwell on what do we mean by responsibility in the context of carbon dioxide removal. And I want to basically give you three thought pieces, and they are as follows. First of all, number one, the level of public support and timing thereof for carbon dioxide removal. And it's based on the issues with the scale-up, the inertia of scale-up, and also the inertia that we all know that we're seeing regarding our progress on emissions reduction. So that's issue one. Issue two are basically the level of policies, incentives, and the measures to prevent increasing emissions or just continuing emissions, but whilst also encouraging marine carbon dioxide removal and other forms of carbon dioxide removal as well. And the last one, which is actually, I think, the really thorny one, which is the wider context of climate finance and the needs of people today. So I want to sort of just give a few minutes unpacking those 3 points. So the first one, level of public support and timing. We have limited financial resources at any moment in time. Governments know this, as do we all, just about how much you can invest and how much you can borrow and what all that does. And we've got two big levers that are currently being considered in terms of our action on tackling climate change. The first is clearly emissions reduction, and the second is the inevitable need to have significant carbon dioxide removal. And where are we today with carbon dioxide removal? If we just think about the things that Jill in particular has spoken about, the world of the ocean. So 70% of the world's surface is covered in the ocean. Where are we in terms of technology understanding of the different approaches for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal? And we're not where we need to be. We're not where we need to be to make informed decisions regarding which of these particular approaches are appropriate, which ones are going to really sort of have a big impact. We need to put more money into research and development before we even go really hard at deployment. But we've got this really big problem, is that the longer that we leave it, including deployment, there's just the scale up of industry. No matter how much you're going to throw money at this isn't a software business where you can have incredible rates of increase in terms of a commercial capability, where all you're doing is selling information which goes through wires. It's incredibly quick to be able to grow really big businesses like Google, Facebook, etc. When you're dealing with hard facts of hard machinery or just natural systems that take a while to grow, we've got an inertia in the system which we need to account for. So we need to do more research and development, and then we're going to need to provide finance for that and finance for and support of the deployment and the scale up of this. But it's not just about carbon dioxide removal. We need to be applying the same level of support, arguably even more, for emissions reduction. We've got to stop the problems getting worse. So what are we doing regarding helping developing countries not just go and rely on the ways that the global north did, which is the fossil fuel way of doing things, but actually go and transition away and enjoy a different growth curve than the ones that we have experienced in the global north. So we've got to make sure that the resources that we have, which are finite, and we somehow strike the balance between the allocation, between emissions reduction and the growth in our carbon dioxide removal business. But it's not just money. When I mentioned public support, it wasn't just public finance support. There are other aspects too. It's part of, as Louise said, it's part of being developing a responsible pathway and inclusion of citizens and local communities in whatever action it is, whether it's emissions reduction or, importantly in this context, whether it's to do with carbon dioxide removal opportunities. So we need to make sure that we run as fast as the public and local communities will allow. So we all know that when you build a business, the cash is king. You've got to manage your business so that if you grow too quickly, you can run out of cash. But if you don't grow quickly enough, the investors get upset, and therefore you get fired as a CEO. I mean, I've done it myself, and unfortunately, I was able to navigate that pathway in a successful way. You could say, yes, it's all about judgment. I think judgment and luck come into it as well in terms of the dynamics of the market. We've just heard about the crying for more demand in the ocean-based carbon dioxide removal space. That scares me, where you're having lots and lots of money coming into the space from investors, but if the demand isn't there, this is going to be quite dangerous as an industry. So we've got to make sure that we try and get the financial timescales and how quickly demand grows. But conversely, we also need to make sure in some of these more sensitive areas that we don't run so fast and we don't run ahead of the local community's appetite for this. Public engagement takes time. Public engagement requires a conversation, and it requires earning trust. Trust isn't earned overnight. And therein I'm just laying out the facts that we need to be very careful about how quickly we grow certain approaches, and we're just sensitive to those sorts of issues. I'm not giving you any answers, but you might notice. I'm just saying that these are some of the issues that I'm aware of that we need to somehow navigate. So that was basically number one. So number two, the level of policies and incentives. Well, where are we with, and especially in this COP? We want to encourage carbon dioxide removal, but also encourage emissions reduction. Are we going to go as hard as penalties for exceeding targets, but whilst we're also building up credits and things like this? We're hoping to see rather more progress in the area of Article 6 and how that all works. Some don't like the language of the instrument in terms of carbon credits. Many of the people that I talk about, especially in the academic community, interestingly, a number of them really do not like it. But I'm more of a pragmatist. We need to find a solution to this sort of conundrum as a minimum in order to prevent continuing emissions whilst also having sort of scale up of carbon dioxide removal. And my argument is as follows. We know there are going to be emissions that will continue forever. There are certain activities that we're not going to be able to prevent emissions from. How are we going to feed 8 billion people and just have zero emissions from agriculture? It's not going to happen. So as an absolute minimum, we're going to need to have carbon dioxide removal to compensate, cater for the emissions that will inevitably be continuing. And then rather than having a hard stop, it's clearly, in my view, a sliding scale. Therefore, we're going to continue that to be a net zero, a net negative economy rather than just net zero. That's where we've got to go to. And then number three, the wider context of climate finance and the needs of people today. The insidious nature of climate change is that there is a separation of the timescales between the action that is needed and when the benefits are going to be really, really felt. I know that we're seeing climate disasters right now, but the biggest disasters are yet to come by a long way. And this separation of the timescales between when we need to act and when who's really going to benefit is a real challenge for us all, and politicians especially, because the beneficiaries in large part are going to be those in the future. And looking at the needs of the people today are absolutely critical. So don't know whether you've picked up, but let's just look and listen to what Keir Starmer said today here in Baku. He was questioned by the BBC's Alex Forsyth just this afternoon, and he said he won't dictate how people live their lives, but it's clear that reaching the ambitious Clean Power 2030 mission is vital. And I think that's really sanguine, that we need to think about how we work with society today whilst also building an economy for the future that actually looks at the needs of future generations, not just our children, but our children's children, and so on. So I think this is a really important issue about, clearly it's an emergency, clearly we need to move as fast as we can, but if we move too quickly, we might lose it all together in terms of the appetite of the world. So that's the issue, that's the navigation challenge that we have ahead of us, but there is clearly a significant role for carbon dioxide removal. And on that, I thought we would then close and leave the room for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean. So we're going to take some questions for the audience. And while the mic gets around, I just want to pull on a thread of something that Sean said, because if there's one thing that I would hope you would all take away from this, it is what he just said about net negative emissions. Net zero is not enough. Net zero means we reduce emissions to zero. First of all, very, very hard to do, as Sean has also pointed out. Second of all, it's not adequate. So let's stop having net zero as a target and talk about what net level of emissions reductions and carbon removal are actually what we need to sustain a healthy climate. Question, please.
Thank you. Axel Makalova from Perspectives Climate Research at the University of Zurich. My question relates to yesterday's decision. So it was decided that we have standards for removals under Article 6.4. So you as CDR experts, how would you assess these standards? Are they up to the task? Do they, for example, support sufficiently community engagement? Because as Sean has rightly said, carbon markets are important drivers of finance, and if we want these technologies to be scaled up, they need to be pushed by carbon markets, but in the right way.
Should we leave that for Werner? Werner, are you still online? I wonder whether that might be something that was in your bailiwick.
Yes, I'm still here.
Werner, do you want to try and address that one? Or does anyone else on the panel want to take it?
I can start with it.
I think we might have lost him.
No, I'm here.
I just like to say, I think it's a great start. So I think that's the important factor, that it's a great movement forward and a great step forward. And I think it's also it was a very smart decision to make the announcement so quickly at the start of COP, because we do need to move. And I think it shows and it will demonstrate the huge opportunity that is there in terms of this marketplace. And I think from my point of view, I'd be saying, well, it's important that marine-CDR gets in there as well. But I think it's a great first step. It doesn't cover everything, as you point out, but I think it's the beginning. And I think moving forward on all of the issues that have been discussed today, need to all move forward together rather than, as Sean said, make sure that one doesn't lead the way and we leave some of the points behind. It's a good question.
Can I just add, I think, it's a really good development, but actually also highlights the need for basically more research especially on the MRV side, and the area that I was thinking of is ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. But in a way, the announcement of the standards actually therefore just helps the research agenda. We've known it for a long time that we need to really up our game in terms of being able to verify how we're going to do this. And now the standards are moving in that direction. It means that hopefully we're going to get more support to actually do the necessary work that will underpin all of that.
I don't know whether you can.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I'm Frankie Muscovich from the Property Council of Australia, and I wondered whether you'd offer a reflection on how you'd like to see ambition on CDR reflected in NDCs moving forward. Like, I think you laid out the principles. They need to be separate from emissions reduction, and that those concepts are presented clearly and separately. So I wondered whether you think there are countries that are already doing this well in terms of stating ambition, but how you would like to see this framed, within the context of COPs moving forward.
I can speak. This is not as much as applicable perhaps for an NDC, but I can talk about how California has framed it in the scoping plan, which is our document that sort of lays out our pathway to achieving the state's carbon goals. And for the first time in the most recent update, which is in 2022, it did include carbon dioxide removal and set targets for both natural and engineered carbon dioxide removal. It stops at basically just putting a number in place right now. And that was primarily because it was very controversial. We have a environmental justice advisory committee that guides that process. It was very challenging to get those targets into the scoping plan to begin with. And now we've started a process around sort of refining them and engaging that committee further. At the same time, the state passed a law and also in 2022 to start building a framework, a regulatory framework for carbon dioxide removal And I know, and Barry can probably speak more to this, that was intended to be extended this year through a law that ultimately was not passed, but would sort of build on that. So I think we're slowly building up starting with sort of a target, and now I feel like we're building the foundation and the scaffolding around it in terms of how do you put the guardrails around it and how do you regulate and think about safety and all of those. So it's definitely been it's a start, maybe like the other, but it started the conversation. So.
And I'll just add that some of those principles I mentioned at the beginning came out of those conversations and negotiations around that bill that did not pass, but we hope someday will.
So I'd love to just add, I mean, I do think it really is really helpful to have targets for both at the moment, given the nascent stage of carbon dioxide removal. But I guess what I'd be even more excited about is not necessarily focusing on the NDCs, but actually getting countries to have policies that reflect the NDCs that they're making here. And I think even if we saw that, we see enormous progress. But I'm afraid that's asking for a lot, isn't it?
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Question from Tennant Reid from the Australian Industry Group, particularly for Louise. The process that you outlined for getting that potential project going sounds very, very rigorous and demanding. How confident are you that that level of care and attention to the community engagement and the ethics of the process is compatible with actually doing a bunch of projects? And what kind of veto points are built into the process that you think is emerging?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of our goal is it is very labor intensive and it's a lot of negotiation and mediation. I think the goal is to try to build a process that could be more easily replicated moving forward. I mean, we are very lucky. We have all of our partners are very committed to this process. And so each of the direct air capture companies we're working with is sort of pursuing this technology with a social lens. And so we've really been focused on that. And we've seen other companies not involved with our project also take a similar approach and start to build principles and guidance around how they are deploying their technology. So for instance, Heirloom has a small direct air capture facility operating in California now. So our hope is that it is a model. We don't anticipate that every project will look like this. And certainly we have several that are farther along in the process that do not look like ours. And so our hope is that it becomes a feasible pathway. But I'll be honest, I mean, I think we feel a lot of pressure that it succeed. And I think there's a spectrum of success of what this could look like. So I think ultimate success is we build some really innovative community designed hub, and everything is peachy and wonderful and all works well and everyone sings kumbaya at the end. That would be one, and then I think there are a lot of steps that lead up to that are other metrics of success. So I think even being able to start to elicit from a community and figure out a process for how do you determine goals and vision, how do you mediate across labor, local government, environmental justice organizations, all of whom have different motivations and goals. So, I think we hope to land somewhere in that space, but ultimately with a viable path forward.
I think you had questions.
Thank you to the panel. I'm calling from Indiana University, but I did a master's at Berkeley, so go Bears. So you mentioned a lot about, like engaging the community, building trust, and so on. A lot of times these conversations, right, treat communities as basically passive recipients, right? Like researchers, business people, engineers, right? They come in with basically predetermined notions, right? They talk to these communities and they're hoping to extract very specific answers. But you also said that trust takes time. And so building rapport and, treating climate change as something that is very, very just
as an emergency, right? Like those two things contradict one another. So I wonder, based on your expert opinions, right, how do we reconcile that?
Can you hear me?
Sean, you look like you want to take it.
Well, I'll give it a go. I mean, it is. It's a conundrum in terms of the way to navigate this. I mean, I feel quite strongly that engagement with local communities is not enough, and I think Louise, alluded to this. Is that actually involvement of local communities? So actually, if there are jobs, if there are economic benefits to a community, where actually being part of a research exercise or beyond that, then there are immediate benefits. It's got nothing to do with the climate, even though that's why we're here, right? Because it's about the climate. But that's where we have to sort of go and look at the needs of the here and now, as well as the future. So I think really that's where my head is in terms of trying to navigate this pathway. But I've seen too many exercises where you push too hard too quickly, and you go nowhere. And we have to be very sensitive to that. I don't know whether Louise wants to expand.
Thanks. I just want to say, it's not straightforward, as everybody realises, because there is an example in the MCDR space. Some people might have heard of it, about planetary technologies in Cornwall. They were trying to do a small experiment in Cornwall, and there were two small, almost villages close to each other, and they'd been given virtually the same information, but one of the villages was quite happy to go ahead, and the other village, which is very close by, sort of a very short distance apart, didn't want to go ahead. And the one that wanted to go ahead, the local sort of councillor had scientific background, and they were quite engaged with the process in terms of answering questions and helping people understand and expand the education. And that wasn't the case in the other small town. And so in the end, the project got delayed and didn't go ahead there at all. But it sort of, sometimes it can be very easy to position it as that one solution and one population is all the same, but actually there's little intricacies in terms of who's involved. I'm sure Louise's got many examples that she can expand on, but I think that's a very good example in terms of it's a real situation, and the population, the communities were very similar communities and had virtually the same information and came to different conclusions. So it is a very difficult process and quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that example is perfect. And that's actually, we're doing this right now. I mentioned we have multiple sites that we're looking at for our project. And that actually, we started with a smaller number, and now we've grown because we got feedback and heard concerns about certain sites. And we have one community that's more organized, has been thinking more about this, that potentially is going to be an easier place to actually try to do this pilot. And so we're thinking about those kinds of situations. But I think ultimately, the way I think about this is really, how do we take more place-based approaches, right? And so every community is different. And even within a community, the community is not a monolith. I mentioned, we have a lot of different interests. And so as we think about all of these projects, and you building in some ability to take a more place-based approach is critical if we want to achieve more equitable outcomes, because ultimately having a project that works with and in a place is going to be really central to its success and to sort of, deriving the real benefits from it. And so that's the other piece of this is, and again, I think you point the exact challenge that we have, which is there's time, there's a time and urgency to this as well. One thing we're also doing is we're not starting from scratch. There are organizations and collaboratives and all of these other sort of social and civic infrastructure in place that we can be engaging with and partnering with as we do the work. And so also really trying to think that way, that we're thinking, taking advantage of that. And then the other is this education and co-learning that we're thinking about. So carbon removal curriculum has been a really important piece of this, which is also to let people decide, do they want to even engage in this or not? So that's the other piece. And I use the term engage, even though often I think what we're talking about is something that's much more active in terms of partnership and decision making and power. So when I think about there's a spectrum of public participation, which is like goes from inform, all the way through to basically putting decision making power in the hands of community. And we're definitely trying to work more in this kind of a space that is putting much more power in the hands of community.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to end there because we're at time. I know there's still some questions out there. And I think my colleagues will be around afterwards, and maybe we can take it outside in the hallway. So sorry for those of you who didn't get to ask your questions, but please join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions. This is